Anji Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh. Thank you so much to Imperial Sikh Society for inviting me for this talk. And thank you everyone for coming through today. So I think most of everyone on this call is aware of the large-scale agitations that we're seeing in Punjab today. These agitations have been ongoing for the last few months, and they're tied to the protests that farmers are undertaking in Punjab and in other states, which is due to three bills that have been passed by the current BJP government. These bills have been passed under the guise of increasing competition, cutting waste, improving efficiency. But what they do is hand over control of Punjab's agrarian society and Punjab's agriculture to corporate interests. So the farmers in Punjab have been aware of these developments for a really long time. They've been organizing and they've been articulating and struggling and within the community in Punjab, which has kind of rippled out to the diaspora. So you see like protests happening in UK here in Southall, in Birmingham, in Surrey, BC, in Australia, and this has become like a watershed moment, a really important issue that has from the kind of outset been described as Sadi Hond di Larai, a battle for our existence, a battle of our very survival as Sikhs. And as we all know, Punjab is an agrarian society. Large portions of the economy of Punjab, people's livelihoods, is tied to small-scale farming. And so that means like you have farmers that own like few acres from like 10, 50, 20, 100, 200 acres, and that's like the larger kind of makeup of farming within Punjab. So with these bills, what you see, especially from the discourse that Punjabi farmers are talking about, is how that these bills pave the way for the government support mechanisms that were created to be slowly kind of eroded over time, and then the control of Punjab's agriculture, its future, is then going to be taken over by corporations, because all of those kind of minimum kind of supports and mechanisms that were created by the government as a result of the so-called Green Revolution in the 60s and 70s, those will eventually just become dilapidated because corporations will come in and like fill those spaces. So what's happening in Punjab today, doesn't just emerge like all of a sudden. It is tied directly to Punjab's colonial occupation by the British. So we see that with like the annexation of Punjab in 1849, where the British Empire, or the East India Company, formally takes control of Punjab. Militarily takes control of the economy, all of kind of Punjab's natural resources, including, as we see, its people. So out of that context of colonization, it introduced some drastic changes over a period of 100 years. And those changes saw land ownership be tied to particular individuals. It saw taxation being tied to expected production. So for example, this land is expected to produce, this much grain, therefore the tax will be this much, rather than, how much was actually produced. And then it also saw Punjab's agrarian economy being embedded to serve the larger colonial empire and the demands, of British imperialists and what they saw fit. So basically, Punjab's land was serving the purpose set by political decision makers in Whitehall and in other parts of the British Empire. As well as all of this, we see, over that period of 100 years, we see basically an erosion, an attempted erosion of Sikh being, a complete kind of decimation of our way of life, our way of being, all of our indigenous mechanisms that we had to govern ourselves, that created a relationship between the Sikhs and the land. And then in 1947, when India is supposedly independent. But what actually happens is power is transferred through a process of negotiation between the government here in the UK and the ruling elites in India. So India is now created through this act of partitioning in 1947. Pakistan is created, and Punjab physically bears the brunt of this so-called moment of independence. So in 1947, Punjab is physically divided into two. One of the world's largest militarized borders till this day is established that splits this region of Punjab in half. And this is following the pattern of Britain, that they've kind of perfected this model of dispossession and colonial occupation, because colonization isn't an event that happens in the past. It's not a historic event. It's a structure that's built on top of an indigenous population in order to govern them and exploit their bodies, their minds, to exploit the natural resources of the land. So that's why, we're here in the UK today thinking and speaking in English. Something very violent happened to us, where our Matarti, our motherland, has become foreign to us, and this country has become supposedly our own. So that's like the ongoing process of colonization. So as a result of this process, the indigenous population of Punjab no longer had the right or the ability to effectively determine the future, their own future, their relationship with the land has been um, demolished essentially, and replaced with a form of governance and control that you have to now go through in order to make a living, in order to have a relationship with the land. We see, like, Guru Ka Bagh Morcha, which is this moment of Sikh resistance against colonizers, where Sikhs wanted to go to a forest where they had been going to for centuries in order to collect firewood for the langar. And the colonizers at the time decided that they wanted to disrupt this process as an act of domination. So they set up a barricade, and that resulted in so many Sikhs becoming shaheed, just so that they could go to Guru Ka Bagh to get firewood for Guru's langar. So this process of colonization, what it did is it created a new structure and a new mechanism whereby the people that lived on the land and the state as an entity became like intertwined. So you could no longer have these boundaries between the state and the individual. In fact, the state kind of gave you your right to exist. So in this post 1947 world, Sikh being is now being essentially kind of broken into two. We have a religious institution, the Akali Dal, to represent, the Shromani Gurdwara Prabandhak Committee, to represent our religious existence and our religious kind of needs. And then you have the Akali Dal, which becomes a political entity to represent our political needs. So now the indigenous Sikh Khalsa being is in this post-1947 world as a fragmented entity, and it has to engage with the state, it has to engage with its own way of existing through these structures that have been created with the approval of the state. So this post-1947 world that seeks to kind of create this really tight relationship with the state on top of the people within that post 1947 world, to recover from colonial exploitation. India essentially undergoes like this green revolution, where it's building in order to kind of address the worst aspects of colonial exploitation, and to kind of rebuild India on its own terms. This green revolution takes place, and in that green revolution, we see high yield seed varieties being introduced, which are foreign to Punjab's ecology. You see the introduction of pesticides. You see mechanization, so tractors, combine harvests, tube wells, all of the kind of machinery that's associated with industrialized mechanized farming being introduced into Punjab, which becomes now a market place compared within the rest of the capitalist world. And you also see Western culture being introduced through advertising, through the educational institutions. So not only is Punjab's farming and its agricultural society being impacted by Western Punjab's society and its culture is being massively impacted by Westernization. Um, so obviously that has like a massively detrimental effect, beyond just 1947 itself being like this massively violent moment where millions of people within Punjab are displaced, where you see hundreds of thousands of people being killed as a result of this communal violence as has always been presented, but it actually was a carefully orchestrated moment of colonial violence, because that is part of that mechanism of control to create these tensions that would continue to kind of last within this region that's now been essentially free of, essentially decolonized. So you also see like, the massive ecological impacts which continue to affect Punjab today. So today, one of the biggest problems in Punjab is the dropping water table. And this actually begins with the Green Revolution, with the introduction of rice paddy farming. So rice, crop is a crop that's not indigenous to Punjab, and it's a water-intensive crop. So if Sikhs were to determine Punjab's agricultural crop cycle based on our own interests and based on our localized economy, rice wouldn't feature into that crop pattern as heavily as it does, because Punjab's market is now serving a global market. You can go here today to shops and you can find basmati rice. All of that comes from Punjab. It's not labeled as being a produce of Punjab. It's labeled as being a produce of India. But Punjab is, one of the largest producers of rice paddy in India, and India is the second largest producer of rice in the world. So it's a massive part of Punjab's economy. And then also you see, wheat being planted in the winter, with rice being planted in the summer. So you see this mono crop culture being introduced, which ultimately destroys the natural biodiversity of Punjab, and that delicate balance that exists ecologically. That, with the use of pesticides, with this like Western lifestyle that's being introduced, where you can never kind of attain that lifestyle that's been advertised. So you see massive increase in debts because people always want to buy the latest machinery. They want to live this lifestyle that's been advertised to them. So farmer debt goes up massively. Tied to that, you start seeing farmer suicides. And all of this isn't something that's new. This is, this is something that's been there since the 70s. So Barinder Pal in his paper, where he talks about Sikh resistance and the rise of Sikh militancy, and he talks about the economic factor, and that's always been one of the biggest things. Since the 70s, small-scale farmers, marginal farmers, have been in a crisis, and that crisis has slowly been building, to the point now where this BJP government has presented like an outright fascist face towards the world. So under this kind of neoliberal policies of increasing efficiency and competition, it's actually serving this right-wing capitalist agenda. And in response to this, what we see then in the 80s is, a Sikh struggle to regain Sikh sovereignty for, Punjab Sikhs to determine, Punjab's future. So jumping forward today from like the 80s, today with the farmers' protests, they begin as protests against the bills. That's like when you start following like the discourse and like how this conversation's been developing on the grassroots. It begins very early on that this is a protest against these laws that are being introduced. Very quickly, that protest then starts featuring really heavy Sikh imagery, particularly in Punjab, which is one of the largest Sikh states. Well, it is the largest Sikh population center in the world. So you start seeing Sikh imagery being introduced. You start seeing, people at the grassroots, whether it's singers, whether it's people speaking on the stages, start talking about Sant Jarnail Singh, very early on in the protest. So it goes from like farmers' bills, we're resisting the imposition of this government, we want a better lifestyle, to we need Sant Jarnail Singh to come back, to take us out of this slavery that we've been introduced. So then the language starts changing from discrimination to slavery. And then it starts, all the kind of the conversation that we've been watching from like Shambhu Morcha, which is like, the kind of epicenter of the grassroots farmer agitations. Um, the language starts talking about this is slavery. Before, when the British colonizer was sitting at the Delhi Takat, at the Delhi throne, we didn't have the ability to determine the future of Punjab. Today, the Brahmin hegemony is sitting at the Delhi Takat, and we again don't have the ability to determine the future of Punjab. So therefore, are we free or are we still in a state of slavery? So that language of slavery, of Gulami, starts to kind of permeating the discourse. And then out of that, you start seeing, a solution being presented. So the language of like, this is a battle for our survival, because without agriculture, there's no industry within Punjab, because of the Delhi government's discriminatory policies towards Punjab, where they don't want to invest in any form of industry. We've all been to Punjab. Hopefully, so you will have been to Punjab, and you will see, that there's a really poor infrastructure in Punjab, despite Punjab having, one of the strongest diaspora communities, despite Punjab being, the breadbasket, despite it being supposedly a very affluent, quote unquote, hardworking community. Punjab's infrastructure is incredibly poor. Um, so this level of like discrimination and these policies, these discriminatory policies of the Delhi government towards Punjab, take their toll. And today, like with the protests, this language of autonomy starts becoming central to the farmers' discourse. So then you start seeing people start talking about how the distance it takes from a truck to drive from Punjab to Mumbai to sell Punjabi produce. That's the same distance if we were to go, or if we were to go west, you reach Turkey. So why is it that Punjab isn't allowed to trade, as a state within, a so-called democratic country? Why does Punjab's trade have to be set by the central government? Why does crop prices and these subsidiary prices have to be set by the central government? And that's been like the longest standing contentious issue since the transfer of power in 1947, and the creation of a Brahmin elite to rule India. Punjab has been increasingly discriminated towards. We've seen president's rule being imposed so many times. Punjab doesn't have access or control over its river waters. Punjab doesn't have a state capital like every other state within India. Punjab's been subjected to draconian laws such as TADA, UAPA, which are all rooted in colonial logic and colonial kind of ideas of how to govern through violence. So, the Terrorist and Disruptive Activities Act is a natural a natural successor of the Tribal Disrupted Areas Act. So these colonial laws that make sedition and make criticizing the government a crime, that same logic then comes in through TADA, then the successor of TADA, which is UAPA, the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act. So all of this logic that Punjab is it cannot be a part of the Indian Union on its own terms. It has to be managed. Punjab, is the Sikhs are rebellious. Therefore, these rebellious people, they need to be managed. They need to be treated with a firm hand. And that logic still permeates today, because the role of the Delhi government has been to not give an inch towards Punjab. So even though you see these massive scale protests, where you see like, hundreds of thousands of people in Punjab come out onto the streets, blocking railways, blocking roads, blocking toll plazas, surrounding the houses of politicians, burning effigies of Modi. You see, singers join this movement, Punjab singers, which a lot of them were, our children of farmers themselves. They, kind of turned their back on, the Punjabi music industry and the culture that it's been promoting, which again is tied, when we jump back into the 80s and Sikh resistance, they become the voice of Punjab. They become the voice of, the struggle. And a lot of these singers, feature the imagery of like Sant Janelle Singh in their songs, whether it's subtly or whether it's outright, and they become like the voice of the struggle. And then like this idea that Punjabis are, don't know, or they're not educated, or that is quickly demolished because they Punjabis, the organizing capacity that exists in Punjab is still as potent today as it was like in the 80s. It's just waiting for the right time, the right moment for it to like kind of burst through. So kind of jumping back to the 80s, the environment that we see now is the same kind of environment that was there before, the invasion of Darbar Sahib in 1984. So one of the biggest kind of turning points in these agitations that were building against, central control from Delhi, towards undermining Punjab's autonomy, towards taking away Punjab's river waters, to introducing Western culture in direct conflict with Sikh culture, to undermining the way of life and the existence of Punjabis. One of the key kind of turning points in 1984 was that the Dharm Yudh Morcha, this rising Sikh agitation, this movement, was going to withhold grain shipments from Punjab towards the rest of India, and that was planned for June 3rd, 1984. And we see, like the government invaded Darbar Sahib because one of the generals says this one thing. He says, we cannot let a handful of extremists, or I think he says scoundrels, we cannot let a handful of scoundrels hold the entire country to ransom. So when General Bra said that line, he wasn't talking about Sikhs having nuclear weapons. He wasn't talking about Sikhs having, tanks or aeroplanes or any of the military machinery that the Indian state had. He was talking about this agitation holding Indian economy to ransom, because this agitation now engaged the entire population, or vast swathe of the population of Punjab. Um, and then out of that, when the 1986 Sarbat Khalsa happens, one of and I'll read, one of the proclamations of that 1986 Sarbat Khalsa, when they're talking about what they're fighting for and what is their struggle. This is from the 1987 declaration. And this again is from Barinder Pal's work, and I can send a PDF to this if anyone wants to read. So he says, this congregation of today proclaims for the information of the whole world that the Khalsa who wishes the welfare of all, Sarbat Dapala, shall never attack the poor and the oppressed, the Muslim. The present struggle of the Sikhs is directed against those plundering and destructive raiders, the Lutere, the Darwaria, and the Vanishkaria, who have assaulted our principles, our Siddhant, our Gurdwara, Gurtam, our Guru Granth, our Bana, our form, our dress, and our Kirt Kamai, our earnings. This assembly of the Sarbat Khalsa strongly endorses the armed struggles of the peoples of the world, especially those in India who are fighting against the tyrant colonial rule for their rights and independence, to maintain their cultural existence, their Sabhyachara Khond, and nationality. This congregation recommends the formation of a religious minorities front to confront the Delhi Sarkar. And then when one of these armed groups, these Jathebandi Adab Khalsa International, is asked why are they fighting and what is their fight for, one of the really important interviews captures this. The Hindu capitalist intends to squeeze the poor economically like a lemon, to such an extent that they can think of nothing more than mere subsistence and keep begging at their doors. These capitalists are leading a luxurious life after having sacrificed the means of subsistence, the sons, the youth, the honor and dignity of the poor. So when we see Sikh resistance building, as we see Sikh resistance building now, at the core of it is an awareness of the international so-called order, an awareness of the nature of the state and its role with suppressing poor people, and suppressing anybody that basically doesn't have power. And they're like the Khalsa, the Sikhs, take up their role that they have throughout their history of taking power away from those that claim to have power, and kind of distributing the Kudrati boons, the boons of nature, the kudrati nimayanta, distribute the natural boons and meet the bare minimum needs on a humane basis. So this has always been the driving force of Sikh resistance. So today, when we see like these farmer agitations, this is a moment that needs to be looked after carefully, because it's going to go in one of two directions. Either it's going to the people that are resisting are going to become tired, because this requires an immense personal sacrifice. It means you're going to suffer on all fronts, because especially if you're going against cooperating with the government, or we're going to see an increase of violence from the state, and they're waiting for that moment to increase the pitch of violence. They're doing all of those preparations to kind of violently crush any form of dissent, so that they can then steamroll their policies in. So this moment that we have of resistance is really important. Um, but it represents an echo of the ongoing clash between Sikhs and the Delhi Takat. This is something that's been kind of building throughout our history, and today is taking another form, and it's already had a massively destructive effect on the political order. It's organized people in Punjab. Early on, we start seeing like loads of songs that come out that talk about Sikh resistance, that talk about something else, that talk about all of these ideas of what the fight is for. um, and yeah, like this this struggle is a reverberation, it's a continuum, it's a cycle that's going to continue to happen. um, and uh, yeah sorry, my mind just completely went blank. But this struggle is the way, the direction it's going in, what we're seeing now, like the language, the feeling that exists there on the ground, it is definitely one to push back against any form of negotiation. So with like the farmers unions, there's 30 farmer unions, that have been around since like the 70s, and they were formed in response to the Green Revolution. And now those farmer unions are sitting down and negotiating in Delhi. And that happened, a couple of weeks ago, where they had this big meeting of the 30 farmer unions. And out of that meeting, I watched one interview with one of the people that was in the meeting, one of the heads of the farmer union. And he comes out of the meeting and he says the government spent the entire time trying to explain the laws to us. Like, that's always been the government's approach, that you're protesting because essentially you don't understand how these laws will benefit you. And he was like, our whole thing was, we're not here to listen to an explanation. We want you to listen to our demands. But those demands will never get accepted. And those farmer unions, unfortunately, they haven't really been effective in mobilizing, the masses of Punjab in this way. Because since the 70s, first the kind of struggle was for the minimum support price, the MSP, which is like a farming subsidy. That has never been correctly applied till this day. That if you know anybody who's a farmer within your family or in Punjab or your extended family, ask them about what the MSP is for, like, kanak, what the MSP is for rice, and what do they actually get in return. And that MSP, that minimum subsidy, has never been applied. And then the kind of the agitation evolved for to push back against farmer suicides. The farmer union agitation was about debt relief, that we want debt relief for these farmers because their crops are failing because of climate conditions, or because of the changing market conditions. So their crop is no longer going to get the value that they thought it was going to get. So we're seeing massive farmer suicide. So we want debt relief for farmers. That was never attained in any meaningful way. So now the struggle is, we want the MSP to be applied. We want the old system, which we were some commentators are calling the MSP a minimum subsistence price. Like, this is the minimum value for your crops you need in order to earn a basic living. And now they want that minimum subsistence price, because that level of involvement of the state within the agricultural economy means that at least corporations won't be able to come in and basically completely demolish any kind of any basic kind of setup that exists. And if we look in, like, America, which is meant to be like, the one of the world's most advanced, powerful nations, its farming and its agriculture heavily relies on subsidies. Same here in the UK. So, this idea that, farming can take place without subsidies or without help from, the public, isn't an idea that actually holds any weight in even these heavily capitalistic countries. So for India to introduce this, that we're going to, erase and erode all of these subsidies, and we want the competition to come into play. What they really mean is large corporations coming in and the government completely stepping out of that equation, and now the large corporations are holding the farmers to ransom, because with the government involvement, there's somebody you can protest against. With the involvement of corporations, it becomes incredibly difficult to hold anybody to account. So the direction this struggle is going in is towards autonomy. It's going in this direction, and this is something that needs to be at the center of the conversation, especially for us here in the diaspora. There's very limited impact that we can take with the struggle that's happening there on the ground. At the very minimum, we can inform ourselves about what's happening on the ground in Punjab, because it does massively concern us. But for us here in the diaspora is, how can we center the conversation around autonomy and sovereignty, and how can we amplify those voices, and how can that become part of the discourse for us, and then we plug into the larger conversation that's happening throughout the Sikh diaspora, because it has a huge impact when we organize here locally, and that's seen and witnessed by people that are resisting in Punjab. It has a big impact on building solidarity. And how can we plug our movement in, which is a movement against capitalist exploitation. It's a movement against imperialism. It's a movement for us to live in harmony with, the Mother Earth. It's a movement for us to have the ecology of Punjab safeguarded, so that the land that gives us so much, that has given us everything, so that we can live in harmony with the land. And all of that is tied to our sovereignty, because without that, those relationships will always have to go through the state, and the state wants to, to take control. And now the way the whole setup is, hand over, our futures to corporations, hand over the very land to corporations. So yeah, I want to conclude it there, and then hopefully we can begin a discussion with any questions. Thank you so much, everyone, for listening.
Thank you very much, Shamsher ji, for the very informative talk. Are there any questions from anyone in the audience, or any topics for discussion?
Would you like to give us more insight about the farmer bills and what, say, we can do, being kind of from the UK, to kind of help out? Because I know there's a lot of charities and a lot of support that way, but is there anything else that we can do to offer our assistance?
Yeah, so I actually spent a lot of time trying to think about this, because I knew you were going to ask this, or someone was going to ask, like, what can we do? Honestly, it's like one of the most difficult questions to answer. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that I can say that's will essentially be a cop-out, but that is the question that we need to answer. And that's the question that needs like some of the most serious amount of work, is that what is the role the diaspora has to play? Because the Sikh diaspora is incredibly powerful. It's probably one of the largest, sorry, not one of the largest, one of the most powerful diaspora communities that exists. But up until now, we haven't really been able to leverage our power as a diaspora. Charity, I think, with charity, the problem is charity becomes the solution, rather than, this a stopgap measure to meet the basic material needs of people. So if your family's starving, we can help through like mutual aid efforts, through charitable efforts, to address that problem in the kind of immediate nature. But it's not the ultimate solution, because the government would love it, like look at Biden and Harris's campaign at the moment, like they want the public to fund their transition team, like you're on one hand capitalists are squeezing you, on the other hand we're like, whatever money we have left over is going into charitable efforts, so we're kind of getting drained on both fronts. So charity can definitely has a role to play, but it shouldn't really be the solution. So the solution is actually like, it's difficult. It's difficult. One of the things that you kind of I was thinking of was how we can kind of influence the conversation that's taking place. National Sikh Youth Federation, we're a member of the Sikh Council here in the UK. I mean, just to give some kind of insight, we've had like, huge difficulty within the internal mechanism of the council for them to give a statement that, endorses a sovereign Sikh position. Their statement takes away kind of, or any kind of communication that any of these representative organizations give. It's always addressing power and addressing the state, trying to get them to, give some of that power up, or, be a bit nicer. It doesn't really speak to the Panth as a sovereign entity. It doesn't center, the response doesn't center around our sovereign being as the Guru Khalsa Panth. It kind of centers around our being as the model minority, our fractured being. So one of the things we can do is like put the Panth at the forefront rather than our individual interests as racialized people in these societies. To be like completely unapologetic when we're talking about our struggle and our resistance and what the nature of our struggle is. One of the biggest kind of victories the Indian state has is, over us is when we're talking about our resistance, when we're talking about the name Sikhs have given to their aspiration for freedom, Khalistan, to make that, a word with such a negative connotation within our own minds and within Sikh spaces. So that's something we can definitely do is center the conversation around our sovereignty, center our organizing around that. Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. I feel when we do try to talk about things, we get censored, right? Such as, kind of the hashtag Sikh, etc. How would you say we go about it? Because, we try talking about it and then kind of the government or, Instagram, Facebook, etc. doesn't allow us to get our voices out there.
Yeah, definitely. The censorship is a big one. Like it's going to be like inevitable. That's the problem with like, these social media platforms that we have, like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Like building redundancy around that, like looking at other alternative, decentralized social media platforms. There's been some kind of conversation around that. I was actually on a call with a few people just the other day talking about, what a Sikh social media would look like that's decentralized, that's built on blockchain technology. Are there alternatives to social media that we could go to, other than Facebook, that we can use as spaces where we can have conversations? It's definitely those are things that we need to look into. The censorship is, it really like, hits the conversation, really hits our community really hard and impacts the conversation massively. Like they're getting very creative now. Before it was just, censorship around like Khalistan or like, Babbar Khalsa or Khalistan Liberation Force. Now like there's censorship around the word Shaheed. I saw a few days ago there's a book launch on Shaheed by Jaswant Singh Khalra that the author Gurpreet Kaur was doing with Basics of Sikhi, and they couldn't go live on Facebook because Facebook had censored the word Shaheed. So hopefully we can reach out to some of these institutions, these like technology companies, and begin conversations with them to kind of correct the image that's been presented through like decades of Indian state propaganda. And in order to like address that, we've got, one of the publications that we've produced through the Khalistan Center that's available on our website. That kind of addresses a lot of the questions around Khalistan, that's aimed for like, Sikh youth. So it empowers us, gives us a framework that we can use when discussing Khalistan. So it hopefully empowers all of us. And so just picking up one of these questions about the mainstream media, there's been like loads of coverage, huge amounts of coverage of the Punjab's farmer agitation, of like, Sikh protests as well. There's been some really cool articles that have come out looking at like the nature of kind of capitalist exploitation and the state. I'll be sure to send some links over to the organizers, and hopefully they can share them with everyone after the call.
I think we've got a question from Prabpreet. he's asked, or she's asked, has the protest gained any traction in the mainstream Indian media or Western media?
Yes, yeah, it has, yeah. It's been covered a lot, especially in Indian media. I mean, there's definitely been like this attempt to kind of demonize the protests as well, because Khalistan and Sikh sovereignty and autonomy are like really like poisonous words in Indian public discourse. And that kind of always precedes any like violent policing efforts. And it's, I mean, this logic of Khalistan being like this, really irrationally violent thing has been used to justify genocide. So, using the language around Khalistan to justify police crackdowns is something that, we're very likely going to see in the coming weeks and months.
Thank you. We've got another question from Harkaran. Do you think we can go back to provide free education / knowledge of how people can fight against corpse? This is a more long-term solution. As outsiders, we can see a different perspective.
Yeah, definitely. Building that solidarity is going to be key for us going forward. I mean, it's something that was outlined like in the 80s as, forming an all India minorities front. Sikhs talk a lot about solidarity. It's a big part of our discourse, but right now we don't really see any effective efforts to build any actual solidarity. Sikhs have more solidarity with like the police and the military, and given this whole model minority trope, you'll see more campaigns around letting Sikhs serve, like even like the Black Lives Matter movement that really captured Sikh discourse for a while, especially with like some of these kind of liberal Sikh organizations. But that very quickly shifted from Black Lives Matter to like let Sikhs serve in the police and the military. So that's something that is going to be one of the most important, and it always has been one of the most important avenues of organizing. One of the lectures I was watching just the other day, it was around Sakkan and Kana Sahib. It was by Mandeep Singh from Sikh Siyasat, and he was talking about how there's two moments in Sikh history that we're kind of faced that are similar to now. One was post 1849, and the other was after Baba Deep Singh's Shahidi. And those were the moments where like all of the Panth's indigenous institutions, mechanisms for self-governance had been completely kind of eroded and demolished, or the remaining institutions that we had had such strict control of the state over them, as we see today, that they became largely ineffective. And he's talking about how like today there's not a single Sikh organization in the world, whether it's religious, whether it's like Samaj Seva, like public service, or whether it's like political, and those obviously those divisions are of the post 1947 world, that has the faith or the trust of the Sikh people. There's not a single one that has our Vishwash as a people, and that's something that definitely needs to be changed. And he was like, when we saw those last two moments where similar to today, where our institutions have been eroded, he's like the Sikh response in both instances was the same. They responded at a local level by organizing, whether it was a group of 5 or 500. They organized themselves. They increased their Bani, their Nityanim, so their connection to Sikhi became much, much more deeper. They tried to manifest Sikhi in their small groups, whether it was 5 or 50 or 500. They really tried to bring that Sikhi out, like from within them. So it reflected in how they thought and how they behaved, and wherever they could, they helped people. So if it was like doing a small scale langar, or whether it's like fighting a battle to help people, wherever they could, so they basically tried to fulfill their function as the sovereign Khalsa at whatever scale they could. I think that's the type of organizing that we have to kind of go back to, and that's what was the period that created Sant Janel Singh, that created like this massive movement of resistance, was the Pind Prachar, creating a deeper connection to Sikhi and organizing at a grassroots level, and building solidarity across communities is definitely going to be key to our approach going forward.
Thank you. We've got another question from Suraj. It's how would sovereignty provide a solution Is it mainly through the introduction of subsidies and increased investment into Punjab? Also, do you think the external investment would be beneficial, i.e. from other organizations, companies, and other than the government?
So sovereignty addresses like the root cause of the issue. So, right now we could take a stopgap measure of charity, of trying to redress the balance, that the state and corporations are kind of trying to tilt in their favor by creating our rival corporations or our rival structures. But it doesn't address the fundamental underlying structural violence of the state. And that's where sovereignty goes much, much deeper as a solution, because it creates a space for us to now exist as the Khalsa, rather than these, uh, fractured beings that have to, can only have a religious identity, and our political identity and our politics and, our, all of that kind of stuff is coming from the state. So sovereignty goes much deeper. It helps us, addresses the pertinent, the important questions of Punjab's ecology. It addresses the questions of Punjab's river waters. It addresses the question of Punjab's place in the world. What is Punjab to the rest of the world? It allows Sikhi to flourish, and all of these things are what's being eroded. And we can go like, the 80s is like the perfect point in time, perfect set of coordinates for us to look at what works and what doesn't work. And we see with Bibi Bimal Kaur, who was, this incredible revolutionary figure, a towering person in Sikh history, and how she articulated what the Sikh struggle was, and how she raised every single issue that Sikhs were facing, whether it was like, encounter killings, whether it was, pesticide use, whether it was the erosion of Punjabi as a language, whether it was the erosion of Punjab's river waters, whether it was, the mistreatment of poor people, whether it was, the denial of Punjab's state capital of Chandigarh, whatever these issues were, she raised all of them through whichever mechanism she could raise. So, she was a part of the Indian Parliament at one point. And then she resigned, saying, that there's nothing that can come from working within a system that so violently wants to see our destruction. And, for her, what she said, which resonates till this day, is that the Punjab solutions will come from Punjab sovereignty. Because when the fight is viewed for and understood and fought for as a fight of our sovereignty and our survival, then the solutions can come out of that.
Would you say that if Punjab was able to gain hold of its water rights, then Punjab itself would have the right to self-determination? I believe water is the crux of the issue.
Yeah, definitely. So, even in the 80s, there's speeches. We did an actual podcast on this as well. I'll make a note of that, and I'll send that podcast on Punjab's water issues to you all as well. It's on our SoundCloud, NSYF SoundCloud. So water issues is definitely a big part of this. Like, in the 80s, Janelle Singh was talking about how, the construction of headworks and dams to take away Punjab's river water is going to impact us for generations to come. Because Punjab's economy is tied to its agriculture. So right now, the kind of the response we see to the water crisis is that the constitution needs to be reformed, or the laws need to be reformed in order for Punjab's water rights to be safeguarded. But what that doesn't take into account is everything that's happening to Punjab's water, and the diversion of Punjab's water is happening according to the constitution and according to the laws. There's nothing that the state's doing that is illegal. It has special dispensation within the bills that were produced in order for it to take water away from Punjab. So the state is always going to produce these kind of violent outcomes. And in one lecture I was watching from Punjab, the guy was talking about how since the 70s, one of the largest rivers in Punjab was diverted, and it wasn't even used. It was just diverted and used to flood villages. And he's like, till this day, those villages that were on path of where that river was diverted are still flooded. It was just that Tibbiyan de vich pani rolta siga. So the water was basically flooded in sand dunes. And he's like, you can still see the level of flooding that happened. He's like, this isn't about them using Punjab's river water. It's about denying you the use of Punjab's river water. And that's why, like, again, sovereignty goes right to the core of the issue. And we can't exercise any rights over Punjab's river waters. If let's accept that Punjab is a democracy and that India is the world's largest secular democracy, and let's accept that in 1947 India was decolonized and fought and won its independence, and Sikhs let's take that model minority narrative, or that Sikhs fought for the independence of India, and we were 2% and we gave 80%, all of that model minority nonsense. Let's accept it on face value. So why is it from 1947 until 2020, that's a long time, why is it in that period of almost coming up to 100 years now, in a short while, like another 20 years, why is it in that period that Punjab's democratically elected Sikh government, hasn't been able to secure one of the most foundational issues of Punjab, which is fair use of its own water? Like, why hasn't that happened? If it's not that the system is structurally being designed to deprive you of your future, why hasn't that happened? So like that process, we can continue with these arguments that process needs more time. That process should be given a chance. That we've had every single chief minister of Punjab has been a Sikh. Every single chief minister. Even during the period in the 80s, when youth were being killed by the government, Bianta was the chief minister. We've had multiple prime ministers of India. We've had a president who's been a Sikh of India. So why hasn't this so-called democratic country been able to resolve these issues in any way? In fact, it's been the opposite. The situation has just got more and more worse and more violent.
Another question is, a lot of people are unsure about Khalistan, as they're unsure how we'll be able to fund ourselves. How do you feel we'll be able to be self-sustainable?
We basically address, I'm going to do a really poor version of, what's written in our report. Again, I'll put the link there, khalistan.org. We've written our first publication from the Khalistan Center is like 50-page publication that addresses a lot of these issues. But Khalistan, by the numbers, is one of the chapters in that is definitely worth a read. We have all of the resources. What we don't have is what's lacking is an imagination and our audacity. Definitely our diaspora is incredibly powerful. We need to take our attention away from striving to fit into this modern minority, and striving for our own sovereignty and our own independence, and having the faith that we can. I mean, the SGPC's budget alone is 90 crore. It's a massive budget just for the SGPC. Punjab's diaspora is incredibly powerful. And off the back of our land in Punjab, the diaspora has been formed. It's because that land has been, put into debt, that people have been able to migrate out of Punjab and then go on to strive, in whichever country that they've gone, and to establish themselves. So it's not a question of resources, definitely. I definitely think it's a question of audacity and imagination, as it always is when it comes to like any struggle for liberation.
I've got my own question regarding autonomy. So in terms of like the long-term future, what do you think we can do about the farmers when eventually autonomy takes over? Maybe let's say in like the next 30, 40, 50 years.
We'll definitely see a more ecologically friendly farming practice that, in Punjab, we'll see a better relationship with the land than we see now. So one of the rewards for the 1980s, when the state responded so violently, to Sikh resistance and this rising Sikh demand for sovereignty, and essentially, out-violenced the liberation movement in order, in the 1990s, where basically by that point they'd been indiscriminately killing Amritari Sikh men in particular between the ages of like 15 and 35, viciously attacking and targeting those individuals because they saw them as being, the backbone of this movement and more likely to support Sikh liberation. As a result of that, that vacuum was filled with an inclusion in a capitalist world. So that's the dream that was sold to people. And today it still forms, a big part of the logic, that we don't want to go back to the chaos of the 80s, because what we have now is peace. And this peace that we have is worth protecting. And that peace is basically an inclusion into the capitalist world. That's what's being sold to us, but we know that hasn't resulted in anything. That's what the result, the net result of that is Punjab's farmers losing, their own agricultural rights over their own land, and that path leading to corporations dominating Punjab's economy. So that reward definitely isn't worth it. What we'll see, like with our vision of sovereignty, is basically limitless, because if Sikhs had won that first war for Khalistan, this isn't the future that we would have chose for ourselves, where we would exist as fractured beings in this world. We would have chose a Sikh vision for existing. Right now, we probably may not have like McDonald's outside Darbar Sahib. Darbar Sahib wouldn't be a tourist attraction the way it is now. It would be the Sikh heart. We would be able to determine Punjab's, natural resources, in a way that benefits Qudrat as well as benefits us, because that's at the core of our philosophy. When we talk about Sarbat da Pala, it's not just, well-being of humanity, it's a well-being of creation. It's about living in harmony with Qudrat, and that's always been at the core of the Sikh way of life. So Punjab's farmers being able to determine Punjab's ecological future, we would see definitely, hopefully, the introduction of farming practices that are seasonal. We'd see more variety of crops being introduced. I was reading a book the other day that was a farming board, agricultural board, that was kind of set up in the 60s, 70s, where they had listed in Punjabi and Latin all of the crops that were being planted at that time in Punjab. Loads of those crops are no longer being planted, and that was post 100 years, odd years of colonization. There was still a massive diversity to the crop culture in Punjab. And now that diversity has just been incredibly eroded to the point now where, Punjab's ecology is like, at threat. So Qudrat di Wan Savanta, like, so that the bountiful nature of Qudrat, that natural variety is something that's really important to Punjabi and Sikh culture.
Yeah, I agree with that. I've just got another, it's not really a question, it's more a controversial statement. A lot of people feel that Punjabis pride themselves on farming, and that is true, it brings in a lot of revenue. However, with the soil being contaminated by all the pollutants and chemicals, as well as Punjab not really receiving much water, is there any kind of sustainability for farming in terms of Punjabis? And if not, what else can we rely on to bring in the revenue?
Yeah, definitely, like what we're seeing at the moment isn't sustainable, and we know it's not, because Punjabi farmers are some of the most debt-ridden farmers in all of India. The suicide rates are really high. Saving Punjab produces a lot of stats on these issues, and we're seeing like huge forced migration out of Punjab. With like half of our villages in Canada right now. You go to our village and it's just the Bazurgs, the old people that are left now in these big houses that the previous generation had built. And that's the case that we've seen in a lot of villages, especially in certain regions of Punjab that have been way more hard hit with this dream that's been sold to them. There definitely can be redress to this. It's just the path to it is going to be a difficult one, and a really long one.
What would the pathway comprise of, do you think?
Like struggle, that's what our solutions will come out of, is going to be struggle. Yeah, and it's not an easy path. Like we've seen it before throughout our history. You know, that connection to Guru Sikhi needs to become much deeper, because that's where that strength will come from to sustain the struggle, and to take us to that point where we're able to determine our own future on our own terms. But I felt I didn't really answer your question because I lost my train of thought halfway through.
No, that's okay. If I can't really remember my question, I think it was more farming and how, you know, we can't really produce too many crops. Is farming going to be sustainable in terms of the future?
Oh yeah, sorry. So, and if farming isn't sustainable, you're saying like what else could we see, right? Like happening in Punjab. So I mean, before the thing that we see now, Punjab's Punjab's economy was incredibly powerful, especially like during Maharaja Ranjit Singh, during the Khalsa Raj, during that time. Punjab's economy was one of the most powerful economies within the South Asian subcontinent. And that's why it was seen as such a high prize by colonizers. And because there were so many other industries as well as farming, there was a thriving industry of textiles. There's a thriving industry of manufacturing, and all of that manufacturing and has largely been replaced because there's been no investment from the Delhi government. And if anything, they've eroded all of the investment that's been taking place in Punjab. But still, to this day, Punjab's textile industry is an incredibly powerful one. All the kind of textiles that you see in the diaspora, that's all imported from the textile workshops and mills that are in Jalandhar, that are in Ludhiana. So Punjab's what can replace farming? Literally, it's the possibilities are limitless. There's been no investment of technology, like no technological economy being built or any kind of infrastructure around that. But definitely that farming is always going to be a big part of Punjab's economy, and that pattern of overusage of groundwater can be reversed. I mean, it's at a point now. It's like it's at a crucial point now, because all of the surface water from the rivers is being diverted. People have been digging down to get groundwater, and that obviously those water deposits have been built up over a really long time. But if we can get access to our river waters again, hopefully we can let the natural water table rebuild up over time. We can start planting more trees. We can have more diverse crops. More animals will start coming into Punjab again, because we've seen all of especially post 80s, the government cut down all of the forests that existed in Punjab because they didn't want those forests as places where Sikhs could hide. And we know throughout our history, right, forests in Punjab have played a massive role in Sikh liberation struggle. The jungles of Kanwan, where the Vadda Kallukara happened, the Chota Kallukara happened. So replanting trees, reintroducing natural crop varieties, investing in other infrastructure, in other sectors of our economy can help bring Punjab up. And again, we have like a huge diaspora community as well that's incredibly powerful, that can play a more important role in kind of changing the direction that Punjab's going in at the moment. Because the direction that we're seeing at the moment, within our lifetimes, witnessing, by the time we have grandchildren, Punjab's biodiversity will be largely eroded, and huge parts of Punjab will become desert, and the water table will be completely eroded as well.
Another question we have from Hawk Curran is, do you think if there was more incentive for young people to stay and invest their knowledge, it could have a big impact, as many people leave and do great work around the world?
Yeah, definitely. there's no incentive at the moment for people to stay in Punjab, because they see their survival as being threatened, and their existence as being threatened. So that migration that's happening today is the same migration that was happening during the colonial period, that began during the colonial period. So at that time, people left, Punjab to come and work in factories and mills, in British colonies, to serve in like supervisory positions in East Africa, while railways were being built. So that migration is essentially a forced migration, because they no longer believed that they would be able to survive in Punjab. But that doesn't mean everyone left. There's three types of people, like saying those that fought, that were died, that were killed, those that migrated out, and those that remained. So that what incentivizing people to stay in Punjab, again, that becomes a question of our sovereignty. Like, so this so-called kind of brain drain of developing countries taking place is something that doesn't just affect Punjab, it affects other countries as well. I know Italy and Poland are two examples that come to the top of my mind, where the government has incentivized people to return, and bring whatever qualifications they have, to serve and educate in Polish universities, to kind of rebuild the economy. So that kind of investment, or that kind of push, will never come with the Delhi government determining Punjab's future. Punjab doesn't have the infrastructure, especially with like not having Chandigarh as a state capital. Punjab's government has always been that government which is friendly towards Delhi. So this is why it's like a running joke, like Badals and Captain Arminder Singh, like it's a completely accepted and normalized reality that they don't serve Sikh interests. I mean, I've been hearing that my entire life, ever since I've been aware of any kind of politics of Punjab, that Badal government or Captain government jeri marji aa jaye, ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਸਿੱਖਾਂ ਦਾ ਨੁਕਸਾਨ ਕਰਨਾ. And we see that till this day, because they want to win favor with the central government, because the way the Indian state set up is, the government will use whatever machinery they have on a local level. Instead of serving the people of the state of Punjab, they will further the government's agenda. This is why in Punjab there's a movement to have Punjabi as its language. The imposition of Hindi is a big a big battle that's taking place throughout India. So definitely that is one way to address this forced migration, is Sikhs returning to Punjab in large numbers, to rebuild the economy, to bring whatever skill set they have, and to kind of reverse that drain of bodies from Punjab that are coming to the West to pursue this lifestyle that's been sold to them in Punjab, that's been sold to us, that will benefit from here. But because the Indian state has such a stranglehold, we've seen with Jaggi's case, we've seen with other cases, if you're going to Punjab with the sovereignty on the agenda, you're going to end up in a prison for a really long time, because sedition is against the law. So they want to create these types of environment that is incredibly difficult for you to pursue the interests of Punjab as a Sikh. And that goes to the core of the struggle. So loads of people have tried. I mean, I've been seeing it myself for the last 10 years, 15 years of, perhaps this charity can be the vehicle through which we can make Punjab rise up. Maybe if we don't go, in a very overt way, maybe if we covertly go and we try to help people, and we try to convince the government that we're not Khalistanis and we're not interested in Sikh issues. We just want to help people. We just want to help the poor people. And I've been seeing that, that route being developed over the last 10 years. I mean, it's arguable, and it's a different conversation of how successful that's been. I'm sure there's views on either side. I know what my view would be on that. But it's incredibly difficult for us to kind of address the issue and provide a solution when state violence is a big part of the equation and a big factor. So this is going back to what does the solution look like? That's something that we have to invest our resources in developing, and and it's struggle. It's a long, determined struggle, where we're going to have to create new vectors of entry into Punjab. Be disruptive with perhaps like blockchain technology and Bitcoin and cryptocurrency could be a new vector of disruption in Punjab. Technology, us leveraging technology in a way to create disruption and challenge the state, because the political landscape in Punjab is changing, in India is changing drastically. We've seen with this farmer agitation, one of the oldest political alliances between the Akali Dal and the BJP fracture. So the Akali Dal is, if it ever did have a veneer of legitimacy, even that veneer has now been eroded. So those old powerhouses, those seats of influence, are no longer as powerful and influence as they were even a few months ago. So that situation is changing massively. It's on us to kind of figure out how we can be creative and disruptive to like the maximum extent possible.
Are there any other questions from anyone?
No, I think we can wrap up here then. Thank you so much for the talk.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, it's been really insightful.
Thank you so much for having me on. And if anyone has a question or anything, you can always drop me like a tweet or a thing on Instagram or something, or send them to yourselves at the Sikh Society. I'll be happy to answer and send any links. Thank you so much.
I think
Thank you.
Thank yous in the comments, and you're really insightful. And thanks, guys, for taking your time out to listen to the talk. Okay, see you in the next talk, guys. Take care. Have a good Saturday.
Good night.
Thank you.
Okay, bye.